The rain poured relentlessly, the heavy droplets pounding against the pavement as she ran, her heart hammering in her chest. She could barely see through the downpour, but that didn't stop her. Nothing could stop her, not when he was in danger. The blaring horns, the screeching tires, and the unmistakable terror in his eyes as he stood frozen in the middle of the road made her forget everything. Without thinking, without hesitation, she lunged forward, pushing him out of the way just as the blinding headlights engulfed her vision. Then darkness. When she woke, she wasn't sure how much time had passed. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled her nose, and the faint beeping of machines was the only thing anchoring her to reality. She blinked against the bright hospital lights, her head heavy, her body feeling wrong. Pain pulsed through her in dull waves, but something else gnawed at her, something much worse than physical suffering. She tried to move her legs, but they wouldn't respond. Panic surged through her veins as she struggled to sit up, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The door opened and there he was. The man she had saved. The man she had loved. For a fleeting second, relief washed over her. He was safe. She had done it. She had saved him. But then she saw the expression on his face. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't concern. It was something cold. Something distant. She forced a smile, despite the fear creeping into her heart. "You're okay," she whispered. He didn't let her finish. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. She blinked. I saved you." His jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "And what am I supposed to do now?" Confusion laced her features. "What do you mean?" "You ruined everything." The words cut through her like a blade. Ruined? She had given everything to protect him, and now, as she lay broken in a hospital bed, all he could see was an inconvenience. "You should have let it happen," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I don't need this. I don't need you like this." The air left her lungs. "Like this," she echoed, her voice trembling. He looked away, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I can't do this, okay? I can't be with you like this." Tears stung her eyes as reality crashed down on her. He wasn't here to comfort her. He wasn't here because he cared. He was here to say goodbye. The love she thought they had, the future she had envisioned, meant nothing to him now. "But I saved your life," she whispered, barely able to comprehend the cruelty of his words. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "Yeah? And now I'm supposed to what? Spend the rest of my life taking care of you." Her entire body trembled. I thought you loved me." His silence was more painful than any rejection. And then, as if to deliver the final blow, he said the words that would haunt her forever. "I never really loved you. I was just waiting for something better." The weight of his words crushed her. He turned his back on her, walking toward the door. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, to tell her this wasn't real. But he didn't stop. He walked out of the room, leaving her behind. The days that followed were nothing but agony. The physical pain of her injuries was nothing compared to the shattering of her heart. She had given up everything for him. Her dreams, her independence, her body, her entire life. And he had walked away without a second thought. Then came the final insult. She had been too weak to move, too broken to do anything but exist in her misery. But one evening, as she lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, a nurse walked in with a pitying look. "Did you hear the news?" she asked hesitantly. Something in her tone made dread coil in the pit of her stomach. "What news?" The nurse hesitated before pulling out her phone, tapping on the screen, then turning it toward her. And there it was, a photo of him, at an engagement party, smiling, laughing, holding another woman. Her blood ran cold as she read the caption beneath the picture. "Celebrating love and new beginnings." New beginnings? Her hands trembled as she zoomed in on the picture. It was her, the woman he had been waiting for. She had spent years believing they were meant to be. She had believed in forever. She had believed that her love mattered. But in the end, she had just been a placeholder. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. How could he erase her so easily? Pain like she had never known consumed her. She had lost her legs. She had lost her love. And now? She had lost everything. Days blurred into weeks. She refused to eat. She refused to speak. She stared at the ceiling, waiting for the pain to end. And one night, as the rain pounded against the hospital window, she closed her eyes and never woke up again. But fate had other plans. Because when she opened her eyes again, it wasn't to the sterile walls of a hospital. It wasn't to a body that was broken and destroyed. No. She woke up in her old apartment. Her body was whole, strong, unaffected. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting everything in a golden hue. And then realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some cruel trick. She had been given a second chance. A chance to change everything. A chance to walk away before she ever wasted a single moment on a man who would never deserve her. A slow, determined smile spread across her lips. This time, she would not save him. This time she would save herself. The air felt different. Warmer. Lighter. There was no dull ache in her bones. No suffocating weight pinning her down. She could breathe deeply, fully, without pain. Olivia's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand where she was. The last thing she remembered was the cold emptiness of the hospital room, the sharp beeping of the machines, the slow fading of her own heartbeat into nothingness. She had died. She knew she had. She had felt the darkness swallow her whole. But now the light outside her window was bright, spilling into the room with an almost surreal glow. The scent of fresh linen and the faint aroma of coffee drifted in the air. Her fingers curled against soft sheets, her sheets. She knew this feeling. This place. Panic shot through her, and she sat up quickly, expecting the sharp pain of her injuries to paralyze her once again. But it never came. Instead, her body moved effortlessly. Whole. Untouched. She gasped, trembling hands reaching to her legs, expecting to feel the familiar absence, the reality of what had been taken from her. But they were there. Her legs. Strong. Perfect. Just as they had been before the accident. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs as she threw the covers aside, swinging her feet over the edge of the bed. She pressed them against the floor, bracing for weakness, for a sharp bolt of pain. But there was nothing. She was fine. No. She was more than fine. She was alive. She stumbled toward the mirror, almost afraid of what she would see. And there she was, her younger self. Her face was smooth, free of the scars and where that heartbreak had left on her. Her eyes, once so lifeless and hollow, were bright, filled with something she had not felt in years. Life. Hope. A second chance. Her breath hitched, her fingers trembling as they touched her reflection. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't some cruel trick of her imagination. She was back. Back before the accident. Before she had wasted years of her life on him. Before she had given everything, only to be discarded like she had never mattered. Memories came rushing back, crashing over her like a tidal wave. She remembered everything. The way he had looked at her in that hospital room, like she was nothing but a burden. The coldness in his voice when he had told her he never really loved her. The humiliation of seeing him move on with another woman before she had even begun to heal. The slow, agonizing pain of watching her life crumble, while he walked away without a single moment of regret. She had spent so much time believing that she had lost because she wasn't enough, that she had been discarded because she had somehow failed him. But now, standing in front of her reflection, whole again, unbroken, untouched by his betrayal, she knew the truth. She had never been the one who was lacking. He was. And now? She would never make the same mistake again. A slow, bitter smile curved her lips. This time she wouldn't be the fool who loved him. This time she wouldn't save him. The first test came sooner than she expected. She had barely stepped outside, still adjusting to the overwhelming surrealness of her second chance, when she saw him, the same way she had seen him that first time. Standing on the sidewalk talking to a friend, his easy laughter floating through the air. The beginning of everything. The moment that had set her on the path toward her destruction. Before, she had walked right up to him, charmed by his presence, drawn into his orbit like a fool. Before, she had fallen too easily, too quickly, believing in a love that had never been real. But this time, she walked past him. She didn't hesitate. She didn't slow down. She didn't even spare him a second glance. And that's when she felt it, the shift. For a brief moment, she could feel his eyes on her. a flicker of confusion as she passed him by without a word. He had expected her to stop. He had expected her to notice him, the way she always had before. But she didn't, because he wasn't worth noticing. The days passed and she made small changes, each one sending ripples through the life she had once known. She stopped answering his messages. She didn't agree to coffee dates. She didn't let him pull her in with his charming words, his effortless lies. She focused on herself, on the dreams she had once put aside for him. She reconnected with old passions, throwing herself into her work, into the things that made her happy. For the first time in her life, she was making decisions solely for herself. And the more she ignored him, the more he noticed. First, it was subtle. A confused glance from across the room. A hesitant approach, asking why she had been distant. But when she continued to brush him off, continued to live as though he was nothing more than a passing stranger, he began to panic. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked her one evening, trying to catch her attention. She simply smiled. "No," she said smoothly. "You never did anything." And that was the truth. He had never done anything. Nothing for her. Nothing to deserve the love she had given him in the past. And this time she wouldn't give him a chance to destroy her again. She was rewriting her story, and he was no longer a part of it. The days stretched before her like an unwritten story, a book she finally had the power to shape. She had spent her previous life making decisions based on him, tethering her happiness to his approval, his love, his presence. But this time she chose herself. She refused to let fate lead her down the same path. Everything about her had changed. The way she walked, the way she carried herself, the way she refused to be swayed by his presence. She could feel his eyes on her every time they crossed paths, searching for the woman who once hung on to his every word. The woman who would have done anything for him. But she wasn't that woman anymore. First, he didn't notice. He still believed she would eventually come back. That she was playing hard to get. That this was just some temporary shift in attitude. He had never seen her as someone capable of truly leaving, of truly choosing a life that didn't revolve around him. She let him believe it for a while. She went on with her life, focusing on the things that mattered. Her passions, her ambitions, the dreams she had once put on hold for his sake. And with every passing day she felt lighter. She felt free. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. One evening as she walked home from work, she saw it. The very moment that had once changed her life forever. The street. The blinding headlights. Him. She knew what was about to happen. She had been here before. In her past life, she had run toward him without hesitation, without a single thought for herself. She had thrown her body between him and the oncoming disaster, and she had paid the price. She had lost her legs. She had lost her freedom. And in the end she had lost him too. And now? Now she stood frozen watching it unfold. This was the test. The universe was asking her what she would do this time. She could feel the past pulling at her, the ghost of her old self screaming at her to run forward, to push him away, to save him. But she didn't move. She did nothing. Her breath was steady as she watched, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She had given everything for him before, and he had walked away like she was nothing. This time she wouldn't make the same mistake. She let it happen. The sound of screeching tires filled the air. A shout. The crash. A moment of stunned silence. And she just walked away. She didn't look back. Not once. Let him feel the fear. Let him experience what it was like to be powerless, to know that the person he once took for granted was no longer there to save him. This time she was the one who disappeared. The whispers started soon after. "Did you hear what happened to him? He got into an accident. Nothing too serious but enough to shake him up. He's been acting different lately. Like he's looking for something, someone." She didn't need to ask who. She could feel the change. He saw her differently now. It was subtle at first. The way his eyes lingered when they were in the same space. The way he hesitated before speaking, like he was searching for something familiar but finding nothing. And then the first attempt. He approached her after work one evening, his hands stuffed into his pockets, that same familiar smirk on his lips, the one he used when he thought he could charm his way back in. "Hey," he said, like nothing had happened, like they were still the same people they used to be. She didn't respond. You've been avoiding me, he said, his voice lighter than it should have been. Or am I imagining things? She simply raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. He shifted uncomfortably. I mean, we used to. No, we didn't, she interrupted. His smile faltered. What? We used to nothing. Her voice was calm, detached, a stark contrast to the girl she had once been. I don't owe you anything. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, confusion, maybe even hurt. Why are you acting like this? She let out a soft laugh. I'm not acting, this is who I've always been. You just never saw it. His jaw tightened, frustration creeping into his features. He wasn't used to this, to being ignored, to being treated as if he wasn't the center of someone's world. You're different, he muttered. She tilted her head slightly, considering his words. Then she smiled. Good. And then just like before, she walked away. But this time he was the one left standing there, watching her disappear. She built a new life. She thrived. She focused on herself, her dreams, her happiness. And the more she flourished, the more he noticed. She saw it in the way his gaze darkened whenever he saw her from across the room. She heard it in the way people whispered about how he wasn't the same anymore. He was losing control. Because she was no longer his to hurt. And that was his real punishment. Not losing her love. Not even losing her attention. But realizing far too late that he had never mattered to her as much as she once mattered to him. And now? He was the one left behind. The world around him felt different, but he couldn't understand why. At first it was just a small shift, a sense that something was missing, something that he had always taken for granted but could no longer reach. He didn't think much of it at first. Life had always worked in his favor. Opportunities fell into his lap, people admired him, and he had always been the center of attention. But now something was off. He first noticed it when he called out to her one day, expecting her to turn around, to greet him with the same warmth, the same eagerness he had always known. But she didn't stop. She didn't even acknowledge him. She simply kept walking as if he didn't exist. That had never happened before. He tried again, approaching her when she was alone, waiting for her to fall back into old patterns. Hey, he said, standing in front of her, blocking her path. She glanced up at him, her face blank, unreadable. He waited for something. Anger, resentment, pain. Anything that showed she still felt something for him. But there was nothing. She didn't even look irritated. She just looked indifferent. You seem different, he muttered, trying to gauge her reaction. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made something twist uncomfortably inside him. Good, she said simply, before stepping around him and walking away. For the first time, he felt something he had never experienced before. Powerless. She had always been there, always waiting, always ready to put him first. And now she was gone. Not in the physical sense, she was right there, existing in the same world as him, but she was no longer his. She was untouchable. He brushed it off at first, convincing himself that she would come around, that she was just playing hard to get. But the more he tried, the clearer it became. She wasn't playing a game. She was done. And then the real downfall began. At first, it was just small things. Plans falling through, minor setbacks at work, moments of frustration that he could shake off easily. But then, one by one, things started to fall apart. A project he had been counting on failed spectacularly, leaving his reputation in question. His friends, the ones who had always admired him, started to distance themselves. They had once hung on to his every word, but now they were treating him like he was just another face in the crowd. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing what it meant to be replaceable. He tried to lean on the people who had always been there, the ones who had supported him when times were good. But they weren't there anymore. And why would they be? He had never really invested in them, never cared about their struggles or their loyalty. He had just expected them to stay. Now they were gone. His confidence, once unshakable, began to crack. He started questioning himself, wondering what had changed. Why was everything suddenly falling apart? And then he realized the truth. He had never been strong on his own. He had never truly been great. He had been lifted, supported, carried by someone who had given everything for him. Her. It had been her love, her belief in him, her sacrifice that had made him shine. And now that she was no longer wasting her energy on him, He was seeing himself for what he truly was. Ordinary. The man he had once been, the one who had thrived, who had always come out on top, that man had only existed because she had been there picking up his broken pieces. And now? Now there was no one left to catch him. He tried to reach out, one last desperate attempt to pull her back into his orbit. He convinced himself that if he could just talk to her, if he could just remind her of what they had, then maybe he could fix things. He found her at an event, standing in a crowd of people who admired her, respected her, celebrated her. She was glowing in a way he had never seen before, surrounded by people who truly saw her. She looked untouchable, but still he tried. He walked toward her, his heart pounding, his hands clenched at his sides. When she turned to look at him, there was no warmth in her gaze. No familiarity. No connection. Just distance. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. She didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him like he was a stranger. And then she smiled. But it wasn't a smile of welcome. It was pity. "You needed me once," she said softly. "And I gave you everything." He swallowed, a knot forming in his throat. "But now," she continued, "I don't need you." The words hit him harder than he expected. "You don't mean that," he muttered, shaking his head. She tilted her head slightly, watching him for a moment before sighing. "I do." And then without another word she walked away. And this time he was the one left standing alone. He watched her disappear into the crowd, into a world he no longer had access to. And that was when it finally sank in. He had lost her. Not just in the way people lose love, not just in the way relationships end. He had lost the one person who had truly seen him, truly believed in him, truly loved him. And without her, he was nothing. He had spent nights staring at his phone, his fingers hovering over her name. He had typed and deleted the same message over and over again. Every version sounded weak. Every attempt felt hollow. But no matter how much time passed, no matter how many times he convinced himself to let it go, he couldn't escape the truth. He had lost her. And he deserved it. His life was nothing like it had been before. He wasn't the man who had once walked with confidence, expecting the world to fall at his feet. He wasn't the man who had once believed she would always be there, waiting, ready to catch him when he fell. Because she wasn't there. Not anymore. And without her, he was falling faster than ever. He tried to move on. He tried to replace her. He surrounded himself with people who laughed at his jokes, who pretended he was still the man he used to be. But none of them looked at him the way she had. None of them knew who he really was. And none of them cared. The realization hit him harder with each passing day. She had loved him. Not because he was perfect, not because he had money or charm or status. She had loved him when he was nothing. She had given him her heart without hesitation, had sacrificed everything for him. And he had destroyed her. He had walked away, believing she would always be there. He had never imagined a world where she wouldn't want him back. But now he was living in that world. And it was unbearable. Everywhere he turned he saw her name. She was thriving. Her life had flourished in ways he never thought possible. She was successful, respected, admired. Untouchable. And it killed him. The night he finally saw her again, it was by chance. He hadn't planned it. He had told himself he wouldn't chase her. But when he saw her across the room, standing there with that effortless confidence, her laughter filling the air, he felt it. The loss. The regret. The unbearable knowledge that she had outgrown him. She didn't need him. And that realization sent a sharp, twisting pain through his chest. Before he could stop himself, he was moving toward her. The crowd blurred around him, the voices faded into nothing. He didn't care about the people watching. He didn't care about what it looked like. He just needed her to look at him. She noticed him before he even reached her. Her eyes met his, and for a brief second, he thought he saw something flicker there. But then it was gone. She tilted her head slightly, watching him approach. Not with warmth. Not with anger. With indifference. That was the worst part. He stopped just in front of her, the weight of everything he had lost pressing against him. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than it used to be. She raised an eyebrow, the smallest smile playing on her lips. "Why?" His throat tightened. "Because I need to." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. That's the thing, isn't it? It's always about what you need. He swallowed hard. I was wrong. Her expression didn't change. I know. The silence stretched between them. I miss you, he admitted, his voice raw. She sighed, tilting her head as if considering his words. You miss what I gave you. You miss who I was when I loved you. But you don't miss me. He felt his chest tighten. That's not true. She smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, but with certainty. Isn't it? He tried to reach for her, but she took a step back, keeping the distance between them. Please, he said, his voice almost desperate now. Just let's talk. Just give me a chance to fix this. Her expression softened, not with love but with pity. In another life, she said, her voice quiet but firm, I gave you everything, and you threw it away like it meant nothing. His hands clenched at his sides. I was stupid. She nodded. Yes, you were. He exhaled sharply. Then let me make it right. Her gaze didn't waver. You can't. The finality in her tone made his stomach drop. Why not? He whispered. Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering. Because this time, she said, I choose myself. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't hesitate. She left him behind forever. And as he stood there, watching her disappear into a world he could no longer be part of, he felt it. The full weight of his regret. The unbearable truth that he had lost the only person who had ever truly loved him. And this time there was no way to fix it. The morning sun streamed through the glass windows of her penthouse, casting golden streaks across the marble floor. The city skyline stretched before her, a breathtaking reminder of everything she had built, everything she had become. She stood by the railing of her balcony, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, taking in the quiet of the morning. This was her life now. Not a life spent waiting for someone to love her. Not a life spent sacrificing herself for a man who never deserved her in the first place. This was a life she had built on her own. And she had never felt more at peace. She thought back to the girl she used to be. The girl who had given everything for love, who had bled herself dry trying to prove her worth to someone who had never truly seen her. That girl was gone now. She had disappeared the day she decided to walk away. She had once thought that love was about sacrifice, that true love meant giving until there was nothing left of her. But now she understood the truth. Real love didn't require her to lose herself. And she had found real love, not in another man, not in validation from anyone else, but in herself. She had built a thriving business, traveled the world, surrounded herself with people who genuinely cared for her. Not because of what she could give them, but because of who she was. She had learned to wake up every day with a sense of purpose, to look in the mirror and feel pride instead of pain. She was whole. And he? He was nothing more than a ghost of her past. She heard about him sometimes through whispers, through passing conversations. His life hadn't turned out the way he expected. The charm he once relied on had faded. The people who once clung to him had moved on. And worst of all, he had to watch as the woman he had once thrown away became someone untouchable. He had tried to reach out again and again. Messages she never answered. Calls she never returned. She had given him too much of her time already. And she wasn't going to waste another second on him. She stepped back inside, setting her coffee down on the kitchen counter, just as a familiar pair of arms wrapped around her waist. She smiled, leaning into the warmth of the man who had never asked her to shrink herself. He had met her as she was now, the woman she had fought to become. He had fallen for her strength, for her independence, for the way she no longer needed anyone's approval to be happy. And that was why she loved him. Because this time, love wasn't about sacrificing herself. It was about choosing someone who let her be free. As she laughed at something he whispered in her ear, she knew. This was what happiness felt like. Not chasing someone. Not begging for love. Not waiting for a man to see her worth. But knowing it herself. Far away in a dimly lit apartment he sat alone, scrolling through photos of her life. A life that no longer included him. And as he stared at the woman he once took for granted, he finally understood. She had never needed him. But he would spend the rest of his life needing her. And that was the real punishment. She picked up her phone, scrolling through emails, barely even noticing the unread messages from him. They didn't matter. He didn't matter. She smiled, knowing that this time she had chosen the right path. She had once thought loving him was her destiny. Turns out, leaving him was her salvation.